Hello, all. This is Dr. Day Maslach talking to you about reciprocity.com. The E is written with a 3. And in this particular video, I want to talk to you about doing research on taboo topics and things to consider when you're doing research on taboo topics. So if you don't know me, I'm an associate professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship, and I created this whole reciprocity project to give back as much as I possibly can. There were so many people that helped me out that I wanted to pay the favor forward and help you out. So I created this sort of sharing economy proofreading platform. That's what reciprocity.com is all about. And then I have blog posts that I've got different PhDs that are writing up, and different sort of research folks that are writing up different blog posts on that kind of stuff. And then I'm doing these YouTube videos to help you out. So I'm trying to build out as many resources as I can to help you do better research and help us do better research as much as I possibly can. All right, so what do I mean about taboo topics? What I'm going to do in this video is sort of describe what do I mean by taboo topics, maybe give some examples, and then finally, just sort of go through some tips to think about this, because we all deal with taboo topics, or a lot of us deal with taboo topics. Okay, so what are taboo topics in research? So these are things that hold a considerable amount of stigma, or they polarize a population in the society, right? So if you talk to somebody, you have, an emotional response. Either you yourself have that sort of flutter in your stomach where you're like, I don't know how this particular person is going to interpret what I'm saying, and I have to add a caveat before I actually say that thing. Or maybe the other person has an emotional response where they can do many different things. They could shut down, they can get angry, they can get embarrassed. All those kind of things can definitely happen whenever you're having this, and it's an emotional response. That's a behavioral. That's more of a response that's even though you might have this sort of cognitive, or you might think about things, right? So you're the sort of cognitive part, or the intellectual part, where you're having kind of an open discussion. You might have that. You might know that this should be an open discussion, but then you have this emotional response or behavioral response where either you kind of just feel uneasy about it, or somebody has an emotional response to that. And that is kind of a natural reaction, right? Embarrassment, for example, is a reaction to feeling uneasy about something, and you might sort of have that response that you get. So basically, it's any sort of topic that you're doing research on that is going to be uncomfortable to have that conversation about and do that research about. So taboo topics can be any sort of thing. So in the basic sciences, chemistry, physics, things along those lines, biology. Well, even biology, you might start getting into taboo topics, but those are going to be less, it's less likely that you're going to reach into those taboo topics. But if you're doing anything in the social sciences, or maybe it's in literature, for example, you're definitely going to run into these things where you are going to run into taboo topics, right? Because that's the stuff that affects us, and it's kind of a social thing that we have, right? So, for example, things like gun control, suicide, almost anything to do with sex, in any sort of way, whether it's your sexual orientation that you have, whether it's sort of what happens in terms of mating that we do as human beings. All of that kind of stuff is definitely taboo topics. Immigration, in this day and age, has become a taboo topic. Religion, politics, anything like that where there is sort of an emotional response. So right now I'm feeling it. I'm going to be honest with you when I'm having this conversation and doing this video. So I'm like, it took me a long time to actually say, am I actually going to do this video? So it took me I've been wanting to do this video for probably about a year now to have this conversation, because I think it's important. And it just sort of, it wasn't until something very recent in terms of having this conversation that inspired me to actually do this. So for me, I do research on medical device adverse events. I really take this stuff seriously. I think about it on a regular basis in terms of like, people are actually going to listen to what I'm saying. So when you're doing research on taboo topics, you definitely have these kind of responses that you wouldn't necessarily think should exist, but we all have these particular responses. And in the social sciences, almost everything that you're doing research on, so in business, even in business, I know it seems like, how innocuous is that? You're just thinking about profiteering, for example, right? Or looking for opportunities if you're in entrepreneurship. But anything that you can do research on, or any particular topic, can be emotionally charged in any sort of way, right? So even just thinking about profits, when I say profits, a lot of people might get an emotional response from it and saying, well, you know what does that mean? What's the implication of profits for a business? What does that mean? Does that mean that you're taking money away from other people? Which is not true, right? So I need to point out that businesses just solve problems. That's all they do. And we hopefully give money in exchange for solving those particular problems. I can get into a whole lesson about that, but I'm not going to get into that. So basically anything that you talk about where people are getting new information that they probably have never experienced before, never thought about before, can go into these kind of unusual areas where you do get sort of taboo topics, and it becomes a little bit, charged, right? So I'm blanking on the economist's name, so you can write the name down. But even in the 1950s, where we simply just said, the basic premise of business should be just for profits only. And I'm blanking on the economists, we're really well known. But the idea behind that doesn't seem like, oh, that's not necessarily all that contentious. But a lot of people have taken it as a contentious view that people shouldn't, or companies should be just pursuing profits, right? But a lot of people might suggest that it is. And so you have to think about those particular implications of it. So what should you think about when you're doing research on taboo topics and thinking about it, right? So maybe you want to do research on sex, for instance, or immigration. What should you actually think about? And as business people, we do go into, or people doing research and on scholarship in business, you might actually go into that, right? So some people might do looking at the business of pornography, for example. I know that seems like it's really uncomfortable for me to actually openly talk about this, and it's embarrassing to openly talk about this. But if you do stuff like that, so the first thing that you should consider, and there's a whole industry on this, right? So it's huge. But you have to be considered, if you do research on those particular topics, that's what you're going to be branded as, and that's what your identity is going to be known as, that particular person. Especially if you're a PhD student and you just come out, and maybe it's your first couple of projects that you've worked on those particular things. That's what you're going to be branded as, and that's what you're going to be well known as, because that stays with you. And that research is going to grow the fastest. Usually will grow the fastest because it's been around the longest. And it has time to sort of accumulate citations and things like that. And so that's where your recognition is going to be from those particular taboo topics. And generally, you're probably going to get more citations on those taboo topics as well, because it's unusual and people might pick up on that particular thing. So that's the thing I want to point out. That's the second thing that I want to point out, is that doing research on taboo topics is incredibly important. And so you should take it very, very seriously, because it sort of sets the tone of the future society. And the things that you find out actually has an immense sort of weight in society. Because if you find something about, maybe it's something to do with immigration that people might not like in whatever particular sort of political spectrum you're from, then that could sort of set the tone, the political discussion, because somebody might actually pick that thing up. It's very likely that somebody's going to pick up that research and use it one way or the other. So you have to be really careful and think about what it is that you're actually saying with that particular thing, right? So the same with religion, right? So actually having a discussion openly about religion is difficult for most people. And if you have a particular view on that, that sort of sets the tone going forward, right? And then it's immensely important, right? So we know about the eugenics movement that happened in the earliest part of the 1900s, right? To really set the tone for a lot of awful, disgusting, and just putrid things that happened during the Second World War, where we were thinking about, or some people thought and took this sort of stuff too seriously. And they really were sort of transforming these ideas into real life implications that set the tone for the rest of the world for many years to come. So you have to really think about that stuff. Your research, particularly on these things that are uncomfortable or they matter to society. And that's really what the signal is saying, is that it matters to society. When you have those sort of awkward sort of, this is unusual to talk about, it's difficult to talk about, that matters to people. And so you have to think about, okay, this thing actually matters. What is it that I'm actually going to say? What is it that I'm actually going to find? I know that we should be unbiased, but at the same time, some findings, it might be uncomfortable and difficult for people to think about. And so you have to be careful with, maybe it's the findings might say something, but you have to be very careful on what it actually says and what you're trying to interpret it as. I can't stress that enough. That's very important for you to think about, because it has strong implications going forward. Might not seem like it at the time, but it will have strong implications on it, particularly the better the sort of research journal that you're publishing in. The other thing, the third thing, so even just, again, having this conversation, really uncomfortable for me to have an open conversation about this. So this is the third thing, you're going to get an emotional response, either from yourself, to have this open conversation about it, right? So, being on YouTube and speaking publicly about this is really, really uncomfortable, right? So even just being on YouTube is really uncomfortable. It's unusual for a professor to be doing this. But being open about it, it is a really uncomfortable thing. And so you might not necessarily, and even if you don't get that emotional response, some people maybe they're born and raised in a family that openly talked about sex, for example. It's uncomfortable for me, but I know lots of people, it was, that they can openly talk about that. So maybe it's not uncomfortable for you, but having that conversation openly with other people is probably you're probably going to get an emotional response from that other person. So you have to be just really careful and thoughtful in what you're saying. And that's an important thing, just to think about how to be thoughtful in what you're saying, so you don't maybe offend the other person, and you can have an open conversation about that. That's really important to think about. And then the fourth thing that you're going to experience is you're probably going to have a lot of social pressure from many different people if you're pursuing that particular topic. Right, so maybe your immediate friends, your immediate researcher friends might tease you about that, doing research on that particular topic, but other people are going to view that in such a way that they might pressure you in a certain way, and pressure you to maybe have a certain political stance on something, right? So maybe you're doing research on politics, and you want to try to be as unbiased as possible. Well, there's going to be groups that are going to try to bias you to go into certain directions, right? And that is that's something that you have to be careful about in terms of that social pressure. So this is a moment as a researcher where you can take a strong leadership role, and you have to be a leader on that particular thing. So if you're a PhD student right now and you are thinking about doing research on taboo topics, know that you're going to have to be a leader. And a leader being that you're going to have to take a stance on something, either saying that I'm going to take a stance to be unbiased with what I'm going to do. That's a stance, and that's a difficult sort of stance that you're going to have to take. And you're definitely going to have to invest the time in the infrastructure. And I'm saying that, going to counseling, for example, having discussions with people about deep discussions about the sort of emotions that you're feeling when you're being a leader, about how to deal with these kind of things, right? So really don't take it seriously, right? So if you're wading in on really difficult topics, then you need to talk to other people on how to actually do that. Right, so people that are in careers that deal with difficult topics, maybe you're on the police force, for example, and you have to deal with really awful things that you see on a regular basis. They have support that allow them to deal with that, and they also don't do it for that long generally. A lot of people can't do it for that long, and that's not a bad thing. right? It's just that it's a really incredibly tough thing to do. So if you're doing something in an area that makes you really incredibly uncomfortable, it's going to expose you to different things. For example, there's famous research on gay bathhouses, which was incredibly famous. And I'm blanking on the research right now, but at the same time, this set the tone in terms of this. You're going to have to be the leader in that area, about being that researcher in that particular area, right? And to stand up about that. And that's going to be tough. Anybody that's doing research, even on the most innocuous things and the boringest things, has to take a stance. You are going to have to take an incredibly strong stance and stand up as a leader. So make sure you have that infrastructure in place, that you can talk to a counselor, that you are well aware of stuff that might happen, and just take it seriously. So the other thing is, so this is the fifth thing, is that if you're doing research on taboo topics, is expect that people are going to ask you all sorts of questions about those things. And so expect it to be really part of your life, going forward, in that that is something that is going to be part of you. So really take it seriously. And that's really what I want to view, or I want to sort of stress when you're making these when you're thinking about going in those particular topics, is know that it's incredibly interesting, right? So inherently, anything that's kind of like on the side or on the fringes, you're probably going to be interested in it, right? Human beings are interested in that kind of stuff. But if you're curious, and if there's data available, and especially in this day and age, just remember that to take it seriously, have a really big conversation with yourself, with other people around you, about whether you actually want to do this, and whether it's an important thing to do for you, because it's going to carry on with you. So make sure that you are just taking it seriously, and everything that means going forward. Even if you publish something in some obscure journal and nobody reads that thing, you're still, you did research on that thing, and you have to carry that thing going forward. And so because it's a taboo topic, there's an emotion that you're going to have to deal with. Doesn't matter what it is, and you're going to feel uncomfortable about openly talking about that. So know that that is something that you have to deal with going forward. However that is, make sure you do get the infrastructure, so counseling, talking to people openly about this kind of stuff, how to deal with all these kind of things. Make sure that you're openly having these conversations with people. Really take that seriously, that you have that available, so that you can carry it forward and deal with these things. So that's all I wanted to say. Again, I'm going to stress, really tough video for me to talk about, but I think it's important for people that are dealing with these things, to be well aware that there are topics that are uncomfortable to talk about, but they are very important, and that we should have an open conversation about them. And that's all I'm going to leave with this. Okay. So if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel. I try to be as helpful as I possibly can. All right. Take care and have a wonderful day. Bye.